Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try to help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. I want to continue the series of signposts we've been doing in 1 Peter, and I want to read a few verses from 1 Peter chapter 2, 18 to 25. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Excuse me. Well, in our previous signpost, we reflected on Peter's command that these believers should submit themselves to every human institution and authority. And we noted the radical nature of the command insofar as it was indeed the authorities who were making life difficult for them. We also noted that the social and political circumstances of Peter's original audience is very different from our own. Whereas the recipients of the letter were living within the Roman Empire, which by that time was a kind of tyrannical state power. In the West, we live within liberal democracies in which the power lies not with the autocratic leader, but with the voting public. Well, at least that's the theory. We try to take note of those differences and reflect on what submitting to the authorities in modern liberal democracies might look like. In summary, our conclusion was that we must obey the law provided those laws do not explicitly contradict the law of God. But even as we obey the law, we have a mandate to speak the truth to power and challenge the governing authorities to act justly and to care for the marginalised and the oppressed in society. And it's with that in mind that from verse 18 onwards, Peter begins to narrow the focus away from the broad scope of their responsibilities to live as good citizens within the empire to the scope of their responsibilities with more personal and domestic settings. And we're immediately confronted but once more by the distance that separates Peter's world from our own. Excuse me. For the first example he gives, that of slavery, is one that the vast majority of us probably struggle to relate to. According to the history faculty of Cambridge University, nothing signals the gap between the modern world and the world of ancient Greece and Rome more starkly than the more or less universal ancient acceptance of slavery. The Bible has plenty of examples of slavery, from well-known stories like that of Joseph, whose brothers sold him to slave traders on their way to Egypt, to the story of the unnamed Israelite girl who was taken captive by the Aramean general Naaman in a raid. Slavery was a natural and accepted aspect of everyday life in the ancient world. In fact, Aristotle famously put human beings into one of two categories, the natural master and the natural slave. It is thought, in fact, that as many as 60% of the population of Rome were slaves. For most of us, our conception of slavery is probably shaped by our knowledge, if we have any, of the transatlantic slave trade in the 18th to 19th centuries. In the UK, the Abolition of Slavery Act was passed by Parliament in August 1833 and came into force a year later, bringing the transatlantic slave trade to an end. And so today slavery is against the law in modern democratic societies in the Western world. In the latter half of the 19th century, the United States engaged in civil war over the issue, leading to the abolition of slavery there. Of course, the abolition of slavery by law does not necessarily mean the end of slavery. As theologian Marion Carson notes, despite slavery being recognised as illegal internationally, nevertheless millions of people are enslaved throughout the world. In the 21st century, slavery is defined as when an individual is exploited by others for personal or commercial gain. Whether tricked, coerced, or forced, they lose their freedom. This includes, but is not limited to, human trafficking, forced labour, and debt bondage. Perhaps one of the most common forms of modern day slavery is, of course, sex trafficking. In fact, it's so common it can be considered as a subset of slavery. As Carson writes, while many slaves find that they are subject to sexual exploitation and abuse, the sheer numbers of women and children who are trafficked into the sex trade to work in prostitution suggests that the current situation is unlike anything that has gone on before. Even where slavery was abolished in countries like South Africa and the United States, a practical apartheid existed for many years, demonstrating perhaps the racism that lay at the root of slavery. So as we approach the text, we must do so recognizing that that slavery in Peter's world was very different from slavery that we are familiar with today. In Peter's world, slavery was not confined to one race domineering another. It was not necessarily permanent, a lifelong state, and it was not necessarily a forced role, as people could volunteer or rather sell themselves into slavery, possibly to deal with debt or get a better life than they might otherwise have experienced. Having said that, the reasons why people were slaves and the conditions of their lives varied enormously in the ancient world. Some prominent preachers in the US today have tried to suggest that slavery was a good thing for the slaves, but they are simply revealing their own inherent racism, as the claim has no basis in reality. As Howard Marshall notes, people were enslaved for various reasons, being children of slaves, being prisoners of war, or falling into debt. The conditions of their service also varied. The general tendency in New Testament times was towards improving the lot of slaves. Manumission was possible if a slave could raise sufficient money from his earnings to secure redemption, or could make a contract to continue to serve his master as a free person. Nevertheless, slaves had no legal position, and a slave was very much at the mercy of his owner for good or bad. And it's perhaps not surprising that critics of Christianity sometimes point to the church's troubled relationship with slavery in order to denounce the faith. And to be fair, they have a point. Over many centuries, the church sanctioned slavery, and not just by looking the other way. In some cases, church leaders actively promoted the idea, certainly, that it was acceptable to take pagans into slavery, or Africans. St. Augustine said that slavery was part of the natural order of things. Throughout the history of the church, many famous, prominent Christians owned slaves. For example, the great evangelist and preacher George Whitefield, who sparked what became known as the Great Awakening, owned several hundred slaves. In the 18th century, the Anglican Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts owned a plantation in Barbados, which contained several hundred slaves who were branded on their chests with the word society. But it's not just that the church is criticised, but the Bible itself. For the New Testament nowhere seems to advocate for the abolition of slavery. In fact, both Peter and Paul give advice as to how slaves and masters should behave towards one another. It's likely that Paul mostly wrote to Christian slave owners, while Peter seems clearly to be writing here to Christian slaves with pagan masters. And it's a fair question to ask why the New Testament writers didn't condemn slavery, and the answer lies in the gap between our world and theirs. As noted, slavery was endemic in the ancient world. It was a normal aspect of everyday life. It was accepted culturally as necessary for the good ordering of society. It's doubtful that cities like Rome could have functioned without a sizable slave population. That was the world into which the church was born. And we should remember that the church was viewed at this time as a kind of atheistic sect, a pernicious superstition, the Roman authorities called it. And of course, the Jews considered them to be heretics. If Paul and the other apostles had started calling for the abolition of slavery, they would have been probably executed as dangerous revolutionaries before you could blink. And the apostles' priority was the proclamation of the gospel that Jesus was the Christ. And so on this and other issues, they appear on the surface at least to accept that things are the way they are and for the sake of their evangelistic ministry. But we should note two important things. Firstly, although neither Paul or Peter calls for the abolition of slavery, they nonetheless took a culturally radical approach by advocating a shift in the relationship. In their world, any slave master would have absolutely agreed with Aristotle, who taught that there could be no true injustice done to a slave because they were to be considered as property, not persons. So Peter's suggestion here that a slave could be treated unjustly in his world was quite a revolutionary thing to say, because it gave value, worth, and dignity to the slave in their own person. Secondly, given that it would have been impossible to abolish slavery, the apostles concentrated on proclaiming the gospel because I think they knew that the moral vision of that gospel would ultimately mean the end of slavery in a very kind of natural way. Becoming part of the community of the church through faith would fundamentally change the relationship status between masters and their slaves. For in Christ they would become brothers, co-heirs with Christ, co-heirs of the promises of God together. In such a relationship, slavery would and did become untenable. Of course, history demonstrates that things did not exactly turn out that way, and we've already noted the church's direct involvement in and profiteering from the slave trade. However, I and many other theologians today would argue that those churches belong to what is called Christendom. Christendom was a uniting of the church and the state into a political, religious, mutually supportive force that shaped the Western world for 1500 years. In doing so, the church effectively abandoned the fundamental aspects of what it means to be the church. Accordingly, many theologians would argue that Christendom was a corruption of Christianity and not a true expression of the faith handed down from the apostles. And I would certainly agree with that. And of course, saying that, though, in no way excuses the abuses of slavery that were committed in the name of Jesus by those who claim to be his followers. The church has much repenting to do in its history. Given that we recognise the inhumane, exploitative and damaging nature of modern day slavery, and that our cultural norms are so monumentally distant from those of Peter and his contemporaries, it's not immediately obvious to see ways in which Peter's advice to slaves and masters is directly or even indirectly applicable to a modern situation. But a number of commentators kind of point in the right direction, I think, when they suggest that employment in the workplace provide a point of connection with Peter's teaching here. Although there are very clear differences, both relationships involve someone being under the authority and direction of another person. And that touches on the underlying principle that Peter makes. I mean, basically, Peter's saying that when we're conscious of God, that is when we're aware that God is watching us, is aware of our behaviour, that we should submit, or the slaves should submit themselves to their masters, even if their masters treat them harshly or unjustly. Underlying this is the sense that if they have done their best to obey their master, but their master is unjust, God sees all of that and will call both slave and master to account for their behaviour. As I often say, no one gets away with anything. As Marshall notes, it stands to reason that if slaves receive a physical beating or lashing because they've committed some misdemeanour or crime, there is no particular credit to them for it, even if they bear it patiently. But if a slave endures suffering that is undeserved, indeed punishment actually inflicted for doing good, then that's a different story. This is commendable in the sight of God. And some scholars think that since Peter doesn't mention slaves again after verse 18, that the rest of the passage is actually just general advice to all believers. Excuse me. So how do we make sense of this in the modern world? How can we apply this to our own lives? I think that Peter's giving some helpful guidance about relationships with others, especially relationships with those who have some authority or power over us. You know, if you're punished at work in some way, for discipline at work in some way, for doing a really bad job, we kind of deserve that, don't we? But of course, sometimes we're treated unjustly at work as well. And I think we can therefore draw several points of guidance from Peter's advice to these believers. Firstly, as Howard Marshall notes, Peter is telling us here that in all social relationships, perhaps especially in those relationships where someone has authority over us, our conduct should spring out of our reverence for God and our desire to do his will. Of course, this is a challenge because we always want to do our own will. We want to be the masters of our own fate and not have to live according to the rules of someone else. The desire to be autonomously in control of our own life stems from the fall in the Garden of Eden. That was Adam and Eve's sin there. And so this is a challenge for us, generally speaking, in our lives, to submit our own lives to God and to his will, to his rule and reign. And that should certainly carry over to all our social relationships, that our conduct should be based not on what we can get out of the relationship or how we're benefiting from it or anything like that, but it should be out of our reverence for God and our desire to honour him and be a good ambassador for him. Secondly, our conduct in all our relationships should fulfil the obligations imposed by that relationship. So if, for example, if we're employed to do a certain job, then we should do that job well to the best of our ability in accordance with our employment contract. You know, we can't just, sit in our office twiddling our thumbs playing solitaire on the computer when we're supposed to be working. In the modern world, this becomes problematic when the relationship itself is forced upon us, as in sex trafficking, for example, or forced labour in factories, or child soldiers forced to fight. Whilst the believer is under no obligation to submit in those kinds of circumstances, they may have no other choice but to obey or face death. We should also note that the perpetrators of forced exploitation may answer to the law and will certainly answer before the throne of God. But each person in that situation has to decide for themselves what actions of theirs would most honour God in that situation. It's not for us to tell them, we who are not in that terrible situation. Thirdly, we can see that disregarding our legitimate obligations brings no credit to the name of Christ and may in fact hinder the gospel. And that should be our priority. Certainly it should take precedence over demanding our own rights. Peter was speaking into a world that no longer exists, and each one of us will have to work out for ourselves what it means to heed his advice. And even if his advice remains relevant in a different world, we have to work out how it remains relevant. But it's helpful to note that Peter's teaching about slaves flows from his understanding of how Christians should respond to injustice. We can add to his teaching today by saying that where a framework of law exists, Christians should always act within it, including acting to end injustice. Peter's concern is that Christians would not retaliate personally. He's not suggesting that we should stoically accept injustice or fail to seek to free the oppressed and the exploited. For if we work to free the captives, if we work to free those who are exploited and oppressed from that bondage, are we not simply walking in the way of Jesus, doing what he did and following his example? And isn't that what being a Christian is all about? Thanks for listening.